it's Benitez here. Welcome back to my YouTube channel. In today's WTF episode, I'm going to share with you all how you can create and send a Teams meeting invite from Microsoft Dataverse or Dynamics 365. For the agenda today, I'm going to talk about whether you can use the Microsoft Teams connector that's available in Power Automate. Then I'm going to talk about the solution followed by the prerequisites. And finally, I'm going to explain the anatomy of a Teams meeting before we jump straight into the demo. In the Teams connector, there is an action that is available in preview called Create a Teams Meeting. If you do use this action, however, what will happen is that it's actually going to authenticate as the Cloudflow maker. So if you have watched my previous WTF episode, I showed you how you can authenticate as an application with the Graph API. And that's because when you use the Microsoft 365 connectors in Power Automate, it doesn't give you the ability to authenticate as an application. It's always going to use the user account of the Cloudflow maker. So what this means is that any colleague within your organization that will create a Teams meeting from Microsoft Dataverse or Dynamics 365 will actually result in the Teams meeting showing up in the Cloudflow maker's calendar rather than the organizer's calendar, and that's because the Teams connector is authenticating as that Cloudflow maker. So the solution to this issue is to actually use the Microsoft Graph API again, where we are going to call the create event request, and that will create a Microsoft Teams meeting. So whenever a Teams meeting is created in Dynamics 365 or Microsoft Dataverse, it will go ahead and trigger a Cloudflow and Power Automate, which is then going to call through the Graph API, which will then create and send that Teams meeting invite. For the prerequisites, you do need to create a new custom activity table in Microsoft Dataverse or in Dynamics 365. So make sure you set the activity type as, this table type as activity. And I've created this in a solution because in the Cloudflow, we're going to use the CDS list records current environment connector. And once you've created your custom activity table, make sure that you update the form so that it will display all the columns that you need for the Teams meeting activity. So in here, the columns that you're seeing is in line with what the Teams meeting request requires. So when an end user fills this out in the model-driven app in Microsoft Dataverse or in Dynamics 365, this is what it's going to look like. The second prerequisite is to have an app registration in your Azure portal, and this is so that you can authenticate as an application with the Microsoft Graph API. I showed you how to do this in my previous WTF episode, so check that out if you haven't already done so. And then finally, the anatomy of a Teams meeting. So what I've highlighted in the screenshot are the different elements that is required by the HTTP request. So this is what it's actually going to look like to the end user, so the organizer, as well as the attendees of the Teams meeting that the organizer has selected. So number one, it's going to need a subject. Number 2 and 3 are the required and optional attendees. Number 4 is the scheduled start and end date of the Teams meeting. And that is tied to number 5, which is the time zone of the organizer. Number 6 represents whether it's a recurring Teams meeting or not. I'm not going through this today in this WTF episode, but it's not an issue to include it if you do need this. And then number 7 is the location of the Teams meeting. Because this is going to be an online meeting, I'm simply setting it to Teams meeting in this WTF episode. And then number 8 represents the content of the Teams meeting. So what is it that you want to display back to the attendees and the optional attendees. And then number 9 finally is a hyperlink that contains the URL for the attendees to join the meeting. So what you're seeing on screen is essentially what we need to build in our Cloudflow, and then we need to pass it to the Graph API request that will create the Teams meeting. Okay, so without further ado, let's jump straight into the demo. Now, a bit of warning, there is a bit of complexity to this Cloudflow, so if your headspace is not in the right place right now, maybe check this out later. Otherwise, come along with me and I'll show you how it's done. Okay, so I'm going to head over to my browser and I'm going to first talk about the create event API request that we're going to send to the Graph API. So this lives under the calendar documentation for the Graph API, and it is called create event. And in here, we can see a sample request. So as I mentioned, when we had a look at the anatomy of a Teams meeting, there's things like the subject, the body, the scheduled start end time, the location, and the important one is the attendees array. So within the attendees array, there's going to be multiple rows that represent the attendees. And in here, you can see that there's an email address property. And within that property, there's two more properties called address, which represents the email of that attendee, and then the name. And then we also have a property called type. So this will define whether they are a required or an optional attendee. Okay, so basically, what you're seeing in here is what we need to have in our Cloudflow. So in our Cloudflow in Power Automate, we have a trigger where it's going to be when the Teams meeting activity record is created in Microsoft Dataverse or Dynamics 365. So this is what I've set it to. So this is what my Teams meeting activity looks like, as you would have seen in the screenshots earlier. And what I'm doing next is using a parallel branch so that we can perform some actions side by side. So I'll start with the easy one. So over on the right hand side, we have a get record, and this is simply retrieving the organizer of that meeting. And this is because we are going to be calling the Graph API as a user. So if we have a look at the documentation, this is what we're going to be using. And this ID is what we call the object ID in Azure Active Directory. And this also happens to be stored as a column in Microsoft Dataverse and Dynamics 365. So that's why we are performing the get user record action. Okay, sorry, I just had to pause there. And then over on the left-hand side, this is where it kind of gets a bit, I wouldn't say complicated, but there's a lot of explanation to do, so bear with me. So this is where I'm using a CDS list records action, and I'm retrieving the activity parties. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Microsoft Dataverse or Dynamics 365, whenever you have an activity record, so if I just head back over here, your any column that represents a person or a collection of people is essentially an activity party. So an organizer is an activity party, the owner of the record is an activity party, your required and optional attendees is an activity party, and so is their regarding value. So in order to retrieve only the required attendees and the optional attendees, we need to filter that out, but that's downstream in the flow. But what we're doing in the CDS list records action is we're basically saying only grab the activity parties that are associated to this team meeting record that was created. And we're also going to apply what we call an expand query. Now, the reason why we are applying expand query is because if I just show you the required attendees column, there's actually 4 tables that you can retrieve a record from that's going to represent the attendee. So we have accounts, contacts, leads, and users. However, when you review the response of the CDS list records action, this is what it's going to look like. So over here, we can see the property ID value that represents that party, which is the lead, so Darlene Dwight. We can see that it's a lead because these 2 properties tell me that it's a lead, but we don't actually have any other additional information about the lead. And as I showed you earlier, in that sample request in the Graph API documentation, it requires the email address of the attendee and the name. So in a CDS list records action, we can use an expand query. So this will retrieve related table values through the navigation property. So if I go back to my run history, it is essentially referencing this field in here. So basically we're saying based on this column, sorry, I keep using field and column interchangeably because we had a recent name change. So basically this property, we're going to expand it so that we can actually retrieve the email address and the name details for this lead. So in my CDS list records action for the lead, I'm saying grab the email address one column and the first name and last name columns. So in the leads table, you don't have a full name, but in the table of contact and user, you do have full name. And basically, we're also pulling through the email address from the account. We're not going to pull through the name because the name is essentially a company. And then for the user, so this is when I'm inviting a colleague as well in that Teams meeting. So in other words, Aaron Rogers, he's my colleague. I'm inviting him to that Teams meeting. We're going to grab only the user's email address. So the schema name of that column is internal email address, and we're also going to grab the full name. So that's what the expand query is doing. It's basically saying just grab the values based on what you've defined in here. So we're going to only ever retrieve those 4 tables. And again, that's because those are the tables that we can pull through in the required attendees and optional attendees columns in Microsoft Dataverse or Dynamics 365. Okay, so the next thing that we need to do is actually loop through those activity parties so that we can form the attendee rows that form this attendees array. So in other words, we need to build a row that represents the lead, which is Darlene, from the required attendees column. And then we also need to have a row that represents Kate Jones, who is a contact, and then Aaron Rogers, who is a user, in other words, my colleague, and they're going to be optional attendees. So that's what we need to do. And as I mentioned, we actually need to filter the activity parties. And to do that, we're using what we call a filter and array action. So basically I'm saying, based on what's returned in the CDS list records action, only grab me the activity parties where their participation type mask value is 5 or if it equals 6. So with an activity party, there's what we call a participation type mask, which has an integer value that represents what the party type is. So as I mentioned, we only need the required and optional party type. So that's why I've got 5 and 6 in my statement in my filter array action. And if you want to know more about how to do and or statements, I will provide a link to a previous WTF episode that explains how you can achieve this in advanced mode. That was for an old action called the condition action. That was when it was version 1.0, but it's still applicable in the filter and array action. And so now what we're doing is we're narrowing it down to only retrieve the required and optional attendees. And the next thing that we need to do is loop through them. And this is where we are referencing the response of the filter and array action. So based on all the activity parties that represent the required attendees and the optional attendees, we're going to loop through them so that we can form that attendee row for that attendees array that's needed in the HTTP request. And this is where a switch action comes in handy. So a switch action allows you to switch based on the field value. So in here, if I just go back to the response, I'm using the property called party ID underscore value lookup logical name. So based on this field, if that field equals contact, then I want to form this row, which is going to be used in the array. And so that's why up here, I'm using an initialize variable action that's going to form my attendees array. So every time we loop through an activity party and based on the criteria, it's going to build that attendees row that we need for the attendees array in the HTTP request. So if it's a contact, based on my expand query, it's going to pull through the email address one column as well as the full name of the contact. If it's an account, likewise, it's going to do the same thing. It's going to grab through the columns that I've defined in my expand query in that CDS list records action. Same with the lead and same with the user. Now with the lead, there is no full name column, and that's why I've retrieved the first name and last name through my select query in my expand query and my CDS list records action. So that's this part in the CDS list records action. Okay. And then finally, we have that type property. So remember how I showed you in the sample response, this will actually define whether that attendee is required or optional. So if I show you this graph API documentation, that property essentially represents whether they're required or optional. And so what I'm doing is if the participation type mask, so in other words, the required attendee equals 5, then we're going to make this value be required. Otherwise, we're going to set it to optional. And that's because in our filter and array action, we're only ever retrieving the participation type mask where it equals 5 or 6. And that way we will only ever have our required and optional attendees based on the Teams meeting activity created. Okay, so then what I'm doing in here is I have a compose action. Now this is only for demo purposes. I wouldn't actually reference this if this was a Cloudflow that I'm using for a customer project. This is for me just to show you the array that's been generated by this apply to each action in the switch cases. So I'll show you when we create a Teams meeting activity. And then finally, we have our 2 actions. So these are HTTP actions. So in here, I am performing a GET request where we're going to retrieve the organizer's mailbox settings so that we can understand what the time zone is. Now, the reason why we're doing this is because, again, if we refer to the documentation, if we want to create an event in the organizer's time zone, we need to include this request header in our HTTP request. And so basically, we need to define what that time zone value is. So another API request that we can use is called get mailbox settings. So again, this is the documentation. And as we scroll down, this is the application permissions that you would need to enable. So you just need to pick one of these. For me, I just picked the read permission. So I enabled that in the Azure portal for the app registration. And we can perform this request based on the organizer's Azure Active Directory Object ID. And we can also narrow it down where it's only ever going to retrieve the time zone value. So when you run it in something like the Graph Explorer or Postman, if you use Postman, this is what the response will look like. So it's actually giving us the time zone of the organizer. And so back in my flow, that's what I'm doing. I'm just calling this API request based on the user's mailbox settings. And then we can use that time zone value in our final HTTP request. So again, what we're doing in here is that we are inserting the organizer's Azure Active Directory Object ID. And so that's because we can create the event as an organizer rather than the Cloudflow maker. And this time the method is post. And in here, I've included that request header where I've set the time zone based on the value that we've retrieved from the mailbox settings request. And then we also have the body. So this is a representation of the sample response that I showed you in here. So if I go back to my Cloudflow, we can see that we've got a subject, which is tied to this column in my Teams meeting activity. We've got the content, which also ties into the description column of the activity. And then we also have 2 more properties, which I mentioned earlier when we went through my slides. So these 2 properties are important because this is how you define that it is an online meeting and what type of online meeting it is. So in here, the property is this one, and we're setting it to true. And the other one is an online meeting provider. So we're setting the type to Teams for Business. So you can actually create one for Skype for Business if you still use it. And so what these two properties do is that when the Teams meeting is created through the Graph API request, it will actually generate the URL that will be embedded as a hyperlink in the Teams meeting. And so this is the hyperlink that the attendees would click on to join that meeting. So these two properties are important. The next two properties is the start and end date of the Teams meeting. So again, for the time zone property, we are referencing the time zone of the organizer from the previous HTTP request that's looking at their time zone based on their mailbox settings. And then for the start date and time, as well as the end date and time, there's this expression that I've used, which again, all of these will be available in my blog post. So check it out when you can if you want these expressions. Is that we're actually converting it from UTC to the desired time zone. Now, there's a story behind this. So essentially, this tripped me up. If I used the value as is from the start time and end time columns in Microsoft Dataverse or Dynamics 365, what was happening was that on the surface, it seemed okay. But then when you actually edit the Teams meeting, it was actually showing as UTC in terms of the time zone and the start and end time. Now, the reason why it was showing as UTC is because in the value that's retrieved from those two columns in Microsoft Dataverse or Dynamics 365, there is the Z character at the end. Now, in Cloudflow, and I'm assuming in any other programming language, if you include the Z, any other local time zone that you've provided will be essentially ignored. It will always use UTC. So then the next thing that I did was, okay, how would I remove the Z then from the value? So once I did that, it looked okay. So when you look at the actual Teams meeting invite, it looks okay. Like it says the time zone. However, the start time and the end time is actually in UTC. So what was happening was, because this time I dropped off the Z, and because all applications render the end time as UTC, it was still displaying it as UTC. So the answer to this is actually something that I learned from, ages ago, and it's in one of my earlier WTF episodes, is to actually convert it first from UTC to the desired local time zone, as well as format it where it excludes the Z. So essentially that's what this expression is. I'll just try to get it to come up again. So we're saying, based on the scheduled start column value, convert it from UTC to the organizer's time zone, and then format it where we exclude the Z. And only then will it actually work beautifully. So I saved you from the headache so that you don't have to go through the headache. So yeah, I appreciate any likes on this video at this point. Okay, and then the final two properties is the location. So we're setting the location to a Teams meeting. And then in here is where we're setting the attendees array. And that is basically going to be based on my initialize variable up here, where the rows would have been created from my apply to each action. Okay, so that is essentially the Cloudflow. So let me hit the back button so that we can have a look at the run history. So I'm in my model-driven app, and I'm signed in as myself. Well, really I should have signed in as Aaron Rogers, but trust me, this is going to work even if another user, so a colleague, creates a Teams activity in Microsoft Dataverse or Dynamics 365. Okay, so I'm going to quickly fill in the fields. So here is where I'll select the lead, and then I'll select the contact K9. And then we're also going to invite my colleague, Aaron Rogers. And then we're going to do a start time of tomorrow morning. So let's say 9 a.m. And we'll have the end time as 10 a.m. And we'll also set the regarding to the lead. Okay, so I'm going to create this Teams meeting. And we'll go back into Power Automate. And I'll give it a few more seconds before I hit the refresh button. Okay, so now it's running. And it's now succeeded. So it only took 12 seconds. That's pretty impressive just to create a Teams meeting invite. Okay, so what I'll show you is the array that was formed. So as you can see, it's correctly only pulled through the required and optional attendees. So we'll see Darlene Dwight, who is the lead. Then we should see K9, who is the contact. And then we should see Aaron Rogers, who is my colleague that we've invited. And then when we look at the mailbox settings request, we can see that it has correctly pulled through my time zone. And then when we have a look at the final action, we can see that in the request header, again, it's correctly referenced my time zone based on the previous HTTP request action. And if we scroll down, we can see that the start time and end time, the time zone is in fact, again, the time zone of the organizer. So let's jump into Teams and let's have a look at the meeting. So here it is. And if I now click on edit, we can see that the Teams meeting has correctly been created. So again, if I start from the top, as you would have seen in the slides, here's the subject. Number 2, here is the required attendees. Number 3, the optional attendees. Number 4 and 5, where it's showing the correct start time and end time and the time zone of the organizer. And then we also have the content and the hyperlink that contains the URL for the attendees to join. So now if I clicked on the join meeting, that would then start the meeting and we would wait for the other attendees to join. What I will show you in the next WTF episode is actually how to display the content with line breaks. So in here you're seeing that it's been rendered as a single line of text, whereas in the model-driven app it's actually showing as separate lines. So I'll show you that in my next WTF episode, so stay tuned. And that's it for today's WTF episode. I hope you learnt and stayed with me right till the very end. Please comment, like, and subscribe, and I will see you in the next WTF episode. Bye!
Turn it up. Let's go.